All right, let's settle in. Lights low, blanket tucked, the world outside fading. Tonight, we're not rushing anywhere. We're going to drift slowly, step by step, forklessly, into the dining halls of the Middle Ages. Because yes, tonight's journey begins not with kings and wars, but with dinner. And as you'll see, that's often where the real absurdity begins anyway. Part 1. What eating in the Middle Ages was really like. Let's start with the obvious. No forks. They existed, technically. The Byzantines had them, and Italy dabbled. But in Northern Europe, a fork was treated with roughly the same suspicion one might reserve today for a stranger licking their bus ticket. People preferred knives, spoons, and, most of all, their own hands. Plates, also optional. Instead, you were given a trencher, which was just a slice of stale bread. Not fresh bread, of course. Fresh bread was soft, fragile, and expensive. Stale bread had the structural integrity to handle stew. So your meal arrived, steaming, dumped directly onto what was essentially an edible plate. And after you'd eaten your portion, the trencher was either tossed to the dogs, given to the servants, or handed to the poor waiting at the gates. Nothing wasted except dignity. Ale was everywhere. At breakfast, at dinner, at weddings, at funerals. Not the strong ale that leaves you singing ballads in a ditch, but a weaker brew called small beer. It was safer than water since water sources were often contaminated, and it gave you a light buzz to get through another day of plowing fields, paying taxes, and wondering whether the Black Death would come back for a third round. The wealthy had wine, naturally. Imported, expensive, and a way to show everyone you were above the ale drinkers. But even nobles diluted their wine with water since drinking it straight was considered somewhat barbaric, which is ironic since they thought forks were too refined. Spices were the true luxury. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, tiny flakes worth more than gold. You didn't sprinkle cinnamon into porridge because you liked the taste. You did it to say, I can afford this, unlike you. Sometimes nobles drowned their food in spices just to flex, even when the combination made no culinary sense whatsoever. Imagine boiled fish covered in sugar and cloves, and you'll understand the medieval palate. For the poor, meals were far simpler. Pottage was the word, essentially a slow-cooked stew of whatever was lying around. Cabbage, onions, barley, beans. Sometimes, if you were lucky, a scrap of bacon. It simmered endlessly on the fire, thickening as it went, until it was less a soup and more a substance. You ate it day after day, each bowl slightly different depending on what was tossed in. Think of it as the medieval version of leftovers, only you never reached the end. The wealthy, meanwhile, indulged in feasts, banquets that lasted for hours, with elaborate courses designed less for eating than for showing off. Roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, boars' heads with apples in their mouths, pies that, upon being sliced, released live birds into the hall. Yes, that last one is real. It sounds charming until you imagine the mess. Feathers in the gravy, and half the guests ducking for cover while your dinner attempts to escape. Table manners were inconsistent. You did not chew with your mouth open, at least not loudly. You did not wipe your greasy hands on the tablecloth. That asks what the dog under the table was for. And if you sneezed, you tried very hard not to sneeze directly into the communal bowl. Because yes, meals were communal. One large dish, everyone dipping their bread, spoon, or fingers in. The personal plate, as a concept, was centuries away. Hunger was a constant companion. For peasants, food was rarely abundant. Harvests failed, winters were long, and famines rolled in every few decades to remind everyone just how fragile the system was. In lean years, people mixed ground-up beans, peas, or even tree bark into flour to stretch their bread supply. It kept you alive, technically, though probably not happily. And then there was fasting. The church required it often. Fridays, Lent, Advent, and various feast days when meat was banned. In practice, this led to creative loopholes. Beaver tails, for instance, were classified as fish, since they lived in water, so you could happily gnaw on a rodent, confident you were still keeping your vows. Eels were popular too, since they could be pickled, dried, or stewed into something resembling soup. And because of course they did, monks found ways to argue that barnacle geese, birds, counted as fish, since they supposedly grew out of driftwood in the sea. Food was about class as much as survival. Nobles flaunted their spice racks. Peasants clung to their cabbages. Everyone drank more than they probably should. And yet, despite all the quirks, the rhythms of meals shaped medieval life as much as castles or crusades ever did. So, when you picture a medieval dinner, don't imagine shining goblets and platters of roast beef, unless you're at the high table. Imagine instead a smoky hall, dogs underfoot, hands greasy with stew, and someone in the corner coughing ominously. That's what eating in the Middle Ages was really like. Perfect. Let's stay at the table a little longer. We've chewed through stale bread trenchers and politely ignored the live bird in our pie. Now let's look at what came after the stew and ale, the entertainment. Because naturally, medieval banquets were not just about eating. They were about spectacle, about showing off wealth, and occasionally about making your guests regret coming at all. Medieval banquets and their strange entertainment. Picture yourself in a vast hall. Tapestries on the walls, smoke curling up to rafters, the floor littered with rushes that were changed. Sometimes. You've eaten enough roasted venison and spiced eel to last a lifetime, and now the host decides it's time for amusement. This is where things get peculiar. One common choice was music. Lutes, harps, fiddles, voices chanting chansons in languages you may or may not understand. Some performers were skilled, others less so. But in any case, the music was background, a polite reminder that the host had culture, or at least could afford people who did. Then came jugglers and acrobats. Men balancing knives, tumbling, swallowing fire. It seems impressive until you imagine it happening in a smoky hall, with a juggler sweating dangerously close to a tapestry worth more than your house. The nobles applauded anyway, mostly because clapping was safer than helping put out the fire. If you were lucky or unlucky, there might be animal performances. Bears, chained and made to dance clumsily. Monkeys, dressed in human clothes, encouraged to mimic guests. Sometimes hunting dogs were brought in and made to leap through hoops. Everyone laughed, ignoring the faint smell of terror radiating from the animals. And then there were the table tricks. Sugar sculptures, dyed in bright colors. Roasted animals reassembled to look alive again. Pies that, upon cutting, released not just birds, but sometimes frogs or even rabbits. The goal was to surprise, amuse, or occasionally horrify your guests, because nothing says hospitality quite like dodging a frog mid-meal. Some banquets leaned into the grotesque. One famous example describes a roasted swan served still in its feathers, posed nobly on the table as if about to take flight. Another feast featured a whole boar, carried in with gilded tusks, music blaring as though this pig were a visiting dignitary. People were supposed to admire, gasp, and pretend they weren't wondering whether the feathers smelled a little singed. For the truly wealthy there was theatrical performance. masks with costume dancers portraying allegories, love, fortune, death, the seven virtues. It was art, technically, but art with a side of confusion, since few guests could follow the symbolism once the wine had flowed freely. Still, everyone clapped and the host looked pleased. That was the point. Banquets were also about politics. Your seating placement mattered. Who sat near the Lord? Who was pushed toward the smoky corner? Who got served first? A banquet was a stage, and everyone knew where they were in the script. If you were at the high table, congratulations, you were important. If you were at the far bench next to the kitchen door and the constant smell of boiled cabbage, well, better luck next feast. And of course, there was drinking. Ale and wine flowed, and with it came the inevitable: slurred speeches, spontaneous singing, and occasional duels of insult. Entertainment, yes, but often provided by the guests themselves. Hosts tolerated it, as long as no one died on the rushes before dessert. By the end of the night, the feast hall was a wreck. Bones tossed aside, spilled wine soaking the rushes, dogs and servants picking over what remained. Guests stumbled out, full of food, ringing ears, slightly dazzled, slightly sick. And the host beamed, because his wealth and power had been demonstrated through roasted peacocks, jugglers, and one unfortunate monkey in a hat. So, medieval banquets weren't just meals. They were theater, politics, chaos, and sometimes mild animal cruelty, all wrapped in smoke and spice, a performance designed less to nourish the body and more to remind everyone exactly who had the power to waste this much food in one night. All right, let's stay at the table a little longer, though now the table is mostly empty. Because for medieval people, eating wasn't just about feasts and trenchers of bread. It was also about not eating, or at least not eating certain things on certain days, in certain ways, while the church kept careful score. So let's drift into the strange world of religious diet plans. The bizarre fasting rules of the Middle Ages. Fasting was serious business. The church calendar was dotted with restrictions, and for much of the year, ordinary Christians were told what they could and couldn't eat. The idea was piety, discipline, and a reminder that the stomach should never be in full control. But, naturally, people turned it into a game of loopholes. Fridays were simple enough. No meat, because Christ died on a Friday. You could still eat fish, which made sense, until you lived in a landlocked village with no access to fish at all. Then you had to get creative. Eels in rivers were fair game. Pike, perch, carp, all suitable. But if you were nowhere near water, things got hazier. During Lent, the rules grew stricter. For 40 days leading up to Easter, Christians avoided meat, dairy, and eggs. Yes, that meant no butter, no cheese, no bacon. A bleak prospect in a world where meals were already heavy on bread and stew. But human ingenuity is endless. So, people found loopholes. One favorite was the beaver's tail. It was meaty, fatty, and, crucially, came from an animal that lived in water. Theologians, in a burst of creative classification, declared it a fish. Problem solved. Rodent on Friday? Perfectly pious. Then there were barnacle geese. Some monks insisted these geese didn't hatch from eggs. Instead, they supposedly grew out of driftwood floating in the sea. Therefore, clearly, they were fish, and thus suitable for fasting days. It was nonsense, of course, but it was wholly nonsense, which made it acceptable. The rules didn't just affect what was eaten, but when. Some monasteries restricted meals to one per day during fasting seasons. Imagine a single bowl of thin pottage, eaten in silence, while a monk read scripture aloud. Not exactly a feast. Meanwhile, in wealthier homes, fasting was treated more flexibly. Yes, no meat, but fish pies stuffed with expensive spices, oysters, salmon, and almond milk sauces were perfectly fine. In fact, fasting often became an excuse for conspicuous consumption. Nothing says piety like a gilded carp covered in cinnamon. Another oddity: almonds. Almond milk became the medieval fasting substitute for dairy. It was expensive, but it let cooks prepare familiar dishes without technically breaking the rules. Puddings, sauces, even cheese substitutes could be made with almonds. The Lenten table might lack butter, but it made up for it with nuts crushed into near oblivion. For peasants, fasting was harder. Fish wasn't always available. Almonds were far too costly, so their fast meant less food, plainer food, and a constant gnawing hunger. What the wealthy framed as spiritual discipline, the poor experienced as yet another reminder that life was already lean. And then there were the people who cheated, secretly frying bacon behind closed doors, claiming illness so they could have meat for strength, or simply ignoring the rules when no one was watching. Confession, conveniently, could wipe the slate clean. So fasting in the Middle Ages was both deeply serious and faintly ridiculous, a system of rules that shaped diets for centuries, yet also inspired some of the strangest theological loopholes ever imagined. If it lived in water, or if you could argue that it might, you could probably eat it. And if you could afford almonds, even better. All right, let's stay in the world of food a little longer. We've sat at their tables, fasted through their holy days, and survived their banquets. But now, let's peek behind the curtain, or, more accurately, behind the smoky wooden doors, into the places where those meals were actually prepared. Because medieval people did not have kitchens in the way we think of them today. No tidy countertops, no gleaming ovens, no cupboards stocked with labeled jars. Instead, cooking was smoky, chaotic, and frequently a fire hazard. How medieval people cooked without kitchens as we know them. Let's start with the basics. The hearth. For most households, the hearth wasn't just where food was cooked, it was the literal center of the home. A fire, usually built right in the middle of the main room, without a chimney. The smoke had nowhere to go but up, swirling until it grudgingly found the thatch roof to seep out. It meant the air was thick, the beams turned black, and everyone smelled faintly of smoke. Permanently. Cooking happened in pots suspended over the fire. Stews simmered endlessly since you couldn't exactly set a timer. Bread dough might be baked under an inverted iron pot, covered with hot embers to create a makeshift oven. And most food had a faint, or not so faint, smoky tang, which was convenient, since it helped disguise the flavor of ingredients that were edging dangerously close to expiration. In wealthier homes, things were grander, but not necessarily more comfortable. Castles and manors had great kitchens, separate buildings, or large side halls, and they needed to be separate, because kitchens were basically tinderboxes. Dozens of roaring fires, spits turning whole carcasses, cauldrons boiling, and smoke so thick you could barely see across the room. Accidents were common. Servants burned, roofs caught fire, and occasionally entire wings of castles were lost to overzealous roasting. Spit roasting was an art form. Imagine rows of meats, boar, venison, peacocks, turning slowly on great spits before open flames. And who turned them? Not the lord, not the cook, but the lowly spit boy. Sometimes a child, sometimes a small servant whose entire job was to sit by the fire and turn a handle for hours, sweating and half asphyxiated, just to keep the meat evenly browned. a miserable task but essential for the feast. There were no refrigerators, of course, so preservation was constant work. Salting, smoking, pickling, or drying food was the only way to keep it from spoiling. Meat was rubbed heavily with salt, then hung in smoky rafters. Fish were packed in barrels with brine. Fruit was boiled down into syrups or preserves. If you had wealth, you had a storeroom full of salted goods. If you didn't, you simply hoped the cabbage lasted until spring. Water was rarely boiled for drinking, but it was boiled endlessly for cooking. Cauldrons hung over the fire full of pottage or porridge. Flatbreads were baked directly on hot stones, and much of the cooking was improvisation. There were no exact recipes, only add what you have in whatever amount seems right, and keep stirring until it looks edible. In monasteries, the kitchens were larger, but no less smoky. Monks followed fasting rules, which meant endless pots of fish, beans, and vegetables. Almond milk was prepared in bulk, pounding the nuts by hand until they released liquid, and everything was cooked with an eye on the rule of Saint Benedict. No indulgence, just sustenance. Though, naturally, some abbots found ways to make simple fish stew suspiciously luxurious. For peasants, kitchens were more suggestion than reality. Most cooking was done in the single-room house over the hearth, but sometimes entire villages shared a communal oven. Bakers fired it once or twice a week, and families brought their dough to be baked inside. You marked your loaf with a distinctive stamp or cut to make sure you took home your bread and not someone else's. It was efficient, smoky, and vaguely chaotic, but it worked. And, of course, there was the problem of firewood. A hearth was hungry, and so was a castle kitchen. Entire forests were stripped to keep the flames going, which meant that even cooking was tied to power. If you could keep your hearth burning, you were surviving. If you had to go cold, you were not. So when you imagine medieval cooking, don't picture tidy kitchens with copper pans and tiled floors. Picture smoke filling a hall, servants dripping with sweat, fires roaring dangerously, and pots that hadn't been properly scrubbed in years. Dinner wasn't just labor. It was survival, spectacle, and an ongoing battle with fire itself. All right, let's keep our plates in front of us a little longer. We've seen smoky kitchens, fasting loopholes, and trenchers of stale bread. But now we're going to wander into the darker corners of the medieval menu, the foods that were less culinary delight and more, why would you do this? Because yes, for every roasted swan paraded into a banquet hall, there was a dish that made even hardened diners quietly regret showing up. The most disgusting dishes ever served in medieval Europe. Let's begin with stuffed animals, not the plush kind, the kind where a deer was roasted, then reassembled with smaller roasted animals sewn inside it. Sometimes a goose inside a pig, inside a cow, because nothing says luxury like cutting into a roast and discovering it has layers. The flavor was questionable, the presentation absurd, but it impressed people enough to keep the tradition alive. Then there was lamprey, a slimy, eel-like fish that clung to riverbeds with a sucker mouth full of teeth. Kings adored it, especially Henry IV of England, who supposedly died from eating too many. It was boiled, baked into pies, or drenched in spices. To us, it looks like a medieval nightmare come to life. To them, it was a delicacy, because of course it was. Another specialty, peacock. Not just roasted, but served redressed in its feathers with gilded beak and claws. Impressive, yes. Edible? Barely. The meat was tough, stringy, and dry. Guests ate it out of politeness while privately longing for something that didn't taste like decorative shoe leather. And then there was hedgehog. Yes, people ate hedgehogs. Recipes instructed cooks to gut and skin the animal, then cover it with flour and roast it on a spit. Sometimes they would stick almond slivers into the back to mimic spines for that extra touch of realism. Guests nodded politely, probably wondering if the cook had run out of actual food. Cockatrice was another gem, a dish created by sewing the front half of a pig to the back half of a goose, then roasting it whole. It looked monstrous, tasted odd, and existed purely to make your guests talk about it afterward. A medieval version of a party trick, only significantly greasier. For Lent, the options weren't always better. One recipe recommended jellied fish heads, boiled until soft, then suspended in gelatin made from more boiled bones. The result wobbled alarmingly and tasted of cold, faintly rotten rivers. But it counted as fish, so at least your soul was safe. And then there were dishes that were less revolting than simply confusing. Take pottage, the endless stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever else happened to be lying around. Some recipes instructed adding fruit, meat scraps, and fish all at once because waste not. The result was a kind of edible chaos, where every spoonful was a surprise you did not necessarily want. Nobles, of course, pushed the limits further. Feasts included porpoise, technically classed as fish, roasted seals, and whale meat. Dense, oily, and difficult to chew, but suitably exotic. You didn't eat porpoise because you liked it. You ate it so everyone knew you could afford it. And finally, there's the dish that deserves a category all its own: meat jellies. Aspic-like creations where chunks of meat floated in translucent, quivering gel. Imagine a boar's tongue encased in a cold wobble. This was considered refined. Your appetite, however, might not agree. So yes, medieval Europe had feasts of grandeur and spice, but it also had lampreys, hedgehogs, cockatrices, and gelatinous surprises. Food that was less about taste and more about status. A banquet designed not to delight the tongue, but to remind you just how wealthy and strange your host truly was. Perfect. Let's cleanse our palate after lampreys, hedgehogs, and questionable aspics. It's time for something sweet. Because while medieval main courses could be baffling, their desserts reveal another side of the era. An obsession with sugar so strong it reshaped trade, medicine, and teeth. Medieval desserts and sweets. More sugar than you'd think. Sugar, for much of the Middle Ages, was closer to a medicine than a food. It was imported at great cost, arriving in hard, crystalline loaves that had to be chipped away with knives. Physicians prescribed it for fevers, stomach troubles, and, ironically enough, bad teeth. But the wealthy quickly realized that sugar had another use. It made food taste better, or at least sweeter. Let's start with the subtleties. These weren't subtle at all. The name referred to elaborate sugar sculptures presented between courses at great feasts. Imagine a castle made entirely of sugar paste, or a knight on horseback crafted in candy. They were rarely eaten, partly because they were rock hard, but they dazzled guests. They were edible art, though most people wisely refrained from testing that claim. Then there was marchpane. We know it today as marzipan, but in the Middle Ages it was a rare luxury. A paste of ground almonds and sugar, pressed into shapes, and sometimes gilded with gold leaf. It was sweet, chewy, and expensive. The kind of treat you brought out only when you wanted to impress someone, or to show off that you could afford almonds. Candied fruits were another favorite. Oranges, figs, and even roots like ginger or carrots were boiled in sugar syrup until translucent, then stored in jars. They were sweet, sticky, and often dyed bright colors with saffron or cochineal. Guests plucked them from dishes with sticky fingers, while hosts pretended not to notice. Of course, there was also gingerbread, but not the soft cookies you're imagining. Medieval gingerbread was a dense, spiced paste made of breadcrumbs, honey, and ground ginger pressed into molds. It was more of a chewy block than a biscuit, but it was loved enough to appear at fairs and festivals. Children gnawed on it like medieval candy bars. Rice pudding appeared too, brought from the Middle East via trade. Cooked with almond milk and sweetened with sugar, it was creamy, fragrant, and often topped with cinnamon. It sounds almost modern, and probably one of the least intimidating things on a medieval menu. But some desserts were decidedly stranger. Blancmange, for example. A dish of shredded chicken, rice, almond milk, and sugar. Yes, chicken in your pudding. It was pale, sweet, and soft, considered good for the sick or the delicate. Not exactly the chocolate mousse of its day, but it had a reputation for being refined. And then there were the sugar lozenges. Pressed into tablets flavored with rosewater or spices, they doubled as both candy and medicine. Children loved them. Doctors prescribed them, and apothecaries sold them at alarming markups. It was medieval multitasking. Cure your cough, rot your teeth. For the grandest feasts, cooks even created sugar wines and syrups. Honey was the usual sweetener, but when sugar was available, it turned ordinary drinks into something rare. Guests sipped spiced wine laced with sugar, enjoying a buzz of alcohol followed by the inevitable sugar crash. So, medieval desserts were plentiful if you could afford them. Almonds, honey, spices, and especially sugar shaped the end of a meal. It wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle, status, and the ability to dazzle your guests with something sweet in a world where sweetness was rare. And yes, their teeth paid the price. Archaeologists often find royal skeletons with alarming cavities. Proof that when it came to sugar, medieval elites indulged as much as we do, only with far fewer dentists. Lovely. Let's keep the table set and the goblets full. We've chewed through trenchers, squinted at jellied lamprey, and nibbled marzipan castles. But all of it, of course, had to be washed down with something, and medieval Europe was very rarely thirsty. How medieval people drank: ale, wine, and questionable water. The first thing to know is simple. Water was suspicious. If it came from a running stream in the countryside, it might be fine. If it came from a town, well, less so. Medieval cities weren't exactly known for their sanitation, so people looked to safer, tastier options. And by safer, we mostly mean alcoholic. Ale was the staple drink for much of Northern Europe. It was made from malted grain, lightly fermented and relatively low in alcohol. Everyone drank it: men, women, children, and monks. It was less about getting drunk, more about having something liquid that didn't immediately kill you, though, of course, too much of it could still leave you weaving in the streets. Ale was also consumed in different strengths. There was small ale, weak and watery, served to children and servants, and strong ale, brewed with more malt, which had a kick. Households brewed their own, and monasteries became known for their careful, almost industrial production. It was a daily necessity, not a luxury. In France, Italy, and Spain, wine was the star. It flowed at noble tables, poured into goblets, sometimes mixed with water, sometimes spiced and sweetened. But don't imagine every glass was a Bordeaux-level vintage. Most wines spoiled quickly, turning sour, so heavy spices, honey, or even ashes were added to mask the taste. Yes, ashes. because medieval people were nothing if not committed to strange solutions. And then there was mead. Honey wine, sweet and golden, often flavored with herbs. It was old-fashioned even in the Middle Ages, associated with ancient traditions and rustic feasting. Kings might drink it at ceremonial banquets, pretending to be heroic figures of old. Ordinary folk brewed it when honey was abundant, sipping it slowly because it was far too precious to gulp. For the upper classes, drinks could be surprisingly creative. There was hippocras, a spiced wine infused with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. It was strained through cloth until smooth and red, then served at the end of meals. Not only tasty, but also thought to help with digestion, though whether it truly soothed the stomach after cockatrice and peacock is debatable. And let's not forget posset, a kind of hot drink made by curdling milk with wine or ale, then sweetening it with spices. Thick, frothy, and comforting, it was sometimes used as medicine. In other words, if you had a cold, your doctor might recommend warm, boozy milk. Practical, if not exactly appetizing. Of course, when alcohol wasn't available, people did drink water. But they preferred it from springs or rivers outside towns, ideally filtered or boiled. Some monasteries took great care to provide clean water systems with aqueducts and cisterns. But for most, water was simply not trustworthy on its own. And then there was the odd matter of cider and perry, fermented apple and pear drinks. Popular in certain regions, they were refreshing alternatives, though rarely as celebrated as ale or wine. Still, they added variety to medieval thirst-quenching. All of this combined to create a culture where drinking was woven into daily life. Breakfast might include ale. Dinner almost certainly did. Monks brewed beer, nobles toasted with wine, peasants sipped cider, and children slurped small ale without question. The result was a society always mildly buzzing. Not roaring drunk at every hour, but never entirely sober either, which may explain some of the stranger choices in architecture, politics, and cuisine. So, while we today might reach for a glass of water, medieval people reached for a jug of ale, a cup of wine, or, if they were especially lucky, a golden sip of mead. Refreshing, questionable, and sometimes fortified with ashes. Because of course it was. Perfect. Let's keep the table groaning under the weight of food and drink. If everyday medieval meals were simple, holiday feasts were anything but. Especially Christmas, which became the medieval excuse to stretch the kitchen, the wallet, and often the stomach far past comfort. Medieval holiday feasts and the over-the-top Christmas tables of the Middle Ages. Imagine a hall lit by flickering torches, rushes strewn across the floor, and a roaring fire in the hearth. At the high table sits the lord of the manor, or perhaps the king himself. Below him, benches filled with guests, retainers, and anyone lucky enough to be invited. The air is thick with smoke, spice, and the faint smell of roasted meat. This was Christmas in the Middle Ages, not the quiet holiday we imagine today, but 12 full days of feasting, drinking, and occasional chaos. At the heart of it was the boar's head. Served with great ceremony, carried into the hall on a platter, tusks polished, sometimes with an apple in its mouth. It was roasted, spiced, and presented as both a meal and a spectacle. The boar itself was a symbol of strength, and serving its head was meant to show off the wealth and bravery of the host. Eating it was optional. Other meats crowded the table: venison, goose, beef, and the occasional swan. Yes, swan. Roasted whole, then redressed in its feathers and gilded with gold leaf. It was less about flavor, tough and greasy, and more about prestige. Guests didn't eat swan because it was delicious. They ate it because it meant they had arrived at the fanciest table in town. For the wealthiest households there were also peacocks, cooked, then carefully refeathered and served upright, tail spread. They looked magnificent, even if they chewed like leather boots. Again, status over taste. Christmas also brought out the minced pies. But unlike the fruit-filled pastries we know today, these were mixtures of meat, sweet, fruit, and spices, all baked together, sweet and savory at once, meant to symbolize the wealth of the East, with spices like cinnamon and cloves standing in for the Magi's gifts. They were hearty, strange to our palates, and extremely popular. And then there was plum porridge, the ancestor of plum pudding. A thick, spiced broth of beef, dried fruit, wine, and breadcrumbs. It was ladled out to guests as both food and a symbol of festivity. Sweet, sour, savory, and rich. It was the Middle Ages in a bowl. Drink flowed freely, of course. Ale, wine, mead, and spiced hippocras filled goblets and tankards. Wassail, a hot-spiced cider, was passed around the hall. Guests lifted their cups in toasts of goodwill, which usually ended with everyone fairly tipsy by nightfall. It was as much about community as it was about consumption. And then came the entertainments. Minstrels sang, jesters performed, and mummers, masked players, staged short, chaotic plays. The Lord of Misrule, a figure chosen to preside over festivities, might lead parades, pranks, and general disorder. For a brief time, the social order bent, and peasants could mock lords without punishment, at least until the holiday ended. Food kept arriving course after course. Roast geese stuffed with fruit, pies with live birds hidden inside, ready to burst out when cut, sugar subtleties shaped like castles and saints. It was a sensory overload designed to astonish guests and remind them of their host's power. For the poor, Christmas looked different. They might receive charity loaves of bread, extra ale, or a portion of meat from the Lord's kitchens. Parish churches distributed food, and communities gathered to share what little they had. Even so, Christmas was one of the rare times when ordinary people ate better than usual. So, the medieval Christmas was not silent, and it was not simple. It was loud, messy, extravagant, and sometimes absurd. 12 days of overindulgence, with enough boars' heads, peacocks, and pies to test even the strongest digestion. And when it finally ended, people returned, reluctantly, to their daily bread and pottage. Perfect. We've lingered over boars' heads and wassail bowls. But to really understand medieval food, we need to peer into the little jars on the table, because spices weren't just a garnish. They were wealth, power, and prestige, shaken lightly over your dinner. Part 9. Why spices were worth more than gold in medieval Europe. Let's start with the most famous, pepper. Tiny black grains that today we barely notice, grinding them casually onto eggs. In the Middle Ages, pepper was a treasure. It traveled thousands of miles from India, carried by merchants over land and sea, and arrived in Europe as a symbol of luxury. A single bag of pepper could be used as payment for rents, debts, or dowries. Hoarding it was almost like hoarding coins. Next was cinnamon, imported from Sri Lanka, or, as medieval Europeans believed, harvested from the nests of mythical birds who guarded it fiercely. The story was nonsense, of course, but people loved the drama. Cinnamon added warmth and sweetness to dishes. It flavored meats, pies, and even wine, and, conveniently, it signaled that you were wealthy enough to afford a taste of exotic legend. Then there was cloves. They came from the Spice Islands, tiny specks of land in what is now Indonesia. So rare and costly that nobles often kept them locked away in boxes, brought out sparingly for special dishes. They flavored sauces, studded roasted hams, and masked the less appealing tastes of preserved meat. Cloves were so valuable that wars were fought over their trade routes centuries later. Nutmeg and mace came from the same tree, with nutmeg as the seed and mace as its lacy covering. Both were adored in medieval kitchens. They flavored custards, sauces, and mulled wines. Doctors also prescribed them for everything from stomach pain to plague prevention. Nutmeg, in particular, was carried around like a good luck charm. Rich nobles might wear it in a little pouch, ready to grate into drinks as both seasoning and medicine. Saffron deserves a pause of its own. A spice made from the dried stigmas of crocus flowers, hand-harvested one by one. It took thousands of flowers to make a single ounce. Naturally, it was staggeringly expensive. But it turned food a golden color, and what better way to show wealth than by dyeing your rice bright yellow? It was the medieval equivalent of putting edible gold leaf on your dessert. And then there was ginger, a root shipped dried or candied, used in everything from soups to sweetmeats. It was versatile, warming, and considered a cure for many ailments. Medieval gingerbread, dense and chewy, owed much of its flavor to ginger mixed with honey and breadcrumbs. A fairground staple, yes, but also a reminder of how trade routes reached into daily life. The obsession with spices wasn't purely about flavor. They carried prestige. To serve heavily spiced dishes was to announce, "I am wealthy, connected, and important." A stew flavored with cinnamon and cloves meant you had access to trade networks stretching across continents, even if the stew itself was otherwise underwhelming. Spices also played into medieval medicine. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, meant that foods were classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry. Spices, naturally, were hot and dry and therefore useful for balancing out all manner of supposed bodily imbalances. If you were too phlegmatic, a dose of pepper or cinnamon might set you right. At least in theory, this demand created immense profits for merchants. Venetian traders dominated the spice routes into Europe, growing fabulously rich. Spices arrived by caravan, ship, and eventually by carefully guarded monopolies. Pirates, smugglers, and rival kingdoms all fought over control. The spice trade, more than anything else, helped pull Europe into a global economy. Of course, the irony is that medieval cooks sometimes used spices in ways that would horrify us today. Cinnamon in fish stew, pepper in wine, sugar and cloves in chicken broth. They weren't thinking in terms of savory versus sweet. They were thinking in terms of everything tastes better with expensive things. So why were spices worth more than gold? Because they traveled thousands of miles, they were scarce, they made food taste better, they signaled wealth, and, importantly, they made you look fashionable. Gold could buy land, yes, but a well-spiced feast could buy admiration. All right, let's stay close to the medieval pantry. We've admired the saffron and cinnamon, but none of it mattered if your meat spoiled or your grain molded, because refrigeration, as you might have guessed, was not yet a thing. So, people had to get creative. Preserving food before refrigeration, salt, smoke, and cellars. Imagine a medieval household in late summer. The harvest is coming in, animals are being slaughtered, and winter looms ahead. If you don't find a way to preserve food, you'll be staring at an empty table come January. So entire communities worked together to store, salt, smoke, and stash everything they could. Salt was the foundation. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was life insurance. Salted meat, salted fish, salted butter, everything could be packed in layers of salt to draw out moisture and keep rot at bay. The result was edible, though often jaw-achingly tough and salty. But when it's February and you haven't seen a fresh vegetable in months, you're grateful for even the driest hunk of preserved beef. Salt was so essential that it shaped economies. Salt mines, like those at Wieliczka in Poland, became fortunes unto themselves. Cities thrived on the trade, and rulers taxed it heavily. In some places, salt was literally called white gold. Then there was smoking. Hang your meat or fish above a slow fire, let the smoke penetrate, and you've got something that lasts. It also gave food a rich, smoky flavor, which probably masked the fact that it was weeks or months old. Fish like herring and cod became staples in Northern Europe thanks to this method. Barrels of smoked herring traveled across the continent, feeding peasants and nobles alike. Pickling also entered the scene. Vegetables were submerged in brine or vinegar, sealed in jars, and kept for months. Cabbage, cucumbers, onions, all preserved for the winter table. Pickling wasn't just practical. It added acidity that brightened otherwise bland meals. A medieval stew might taste heavy and earthy, but a spoonful of pickled cabbage cut right through it. For fruits, drying was key. Grapes became raisins, plums turned into prunes, apples and pears were sliced and left to shrivel in the sun. Dried fruit lasted far longer, and when rehydrated in stews or pies, added sweetness to otherwise plain dishes. A handful of raisins could make even the gloomiest pottage a little more interesting. Honey was another preserver. Jars of fruit cooked in honey lasted surprisingly well, and honey itself, being antibacterial, could sit for years without spoiling. This was expensive, yes, but it created luxurious treats like candied nuts and preserved figs. The poor rarely saw honey in bulk, but monasteries and nobles used it often. And then there were the cellars. Cool, dark, and damp, they stored root vegetables, barrels of salted fish, wheels of cheese, and casks of ale. Temperature control wasn't precise, but the earth itself offered natural refrigeration. Potatoes hadn't arrived yet, but turnips, parsnips, and onions lasted well in these underground pantries. Some methods were stranger. Butter, for example, might be packed in barrels and buried in bogs, staying cool and preserved for months. Archaeologists sometimes dig up these bog butters, even today, waxy and intact after centuries. Would you eat it? Probably not. But in the Middle Ages it was perfectly practical. And of course preservation wasn't just for survival. It fueled trade. Salted cod from the North Atlantic, dried figs from the Mediterranean, smoked sausages from Germany. All traveled across Europe, feeding armies, monasteries, and cities. Without preservation, medieval society would have collapsed every winter. So, when you think of medieval cuisine, don't just picture steaming fresh roasts. Picture barrels of salt fish, smoked bacon hanging from rafters, jars of pickled cabbage, and wheels of cheese aging quietly in a cellar. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive. And occasionally, it even tasted good. Perfect. Let's keep our sleepy stroll in the medieval pantry, where the smell is, let's say, distinctive. We've had our pickles and salted fish, so now we're wandering over to the dairy corner, where monks, cows, and the occasional goat were doing their best to keep Europe supplied with butter, milk, and cheese. Medieval cheese and dairy, from monastic butter to stinky monk's cheese. If you've ever walked past an especially ripe cheese and thought, who in their right mind decided to eat this? The answer, more often than not, was a medieval monk, because monasteries weren't just centers of prayer, they were also some of the most industrious dairies in Europe. Milk was tricky. Fresh milk spoiled fast, and without refrigeration you couldn't just pour a glass whenever you wanted. Children drank it, yes, but for adults, milk was mostly a stepping stone to other products, like butter, cream, or cheese. And even then, most adults considered straight milk to be childish, or, in some texts, slightly suspicious. So they found ways to transform it. Butter was one of the simplest. Churn the cream, and suddenly you had something that not only lasted longer but could be salted and stored. Butter was common in the north of Europe, where cows thrived in cooler pastures. In the Mediterranean, olive oil took that role instead. But in England, Flanders, and Scandinavia, butter was everywhere. Monasteries in particular produced it in bulk. Some even stored it in barrels and, as I mentioned earlier, occasionally buried it in bogs to keep it cool. A bog butter barrel, dug up by a modern archaeologist, is essentially medieval Tupperware. Then there was cheese. This was where medieval ingenuity really shone, and also occasionally went very wrong. Cheese solved the problem of milk spoiling in the heat. Curdle it, press it, age it, and suddenly you had something that could last for months or even years. It was portable, valuable, and surprisingly varied. Hard cheeses, like those made in alpine regions, were designed for long storage. These were dense, salty, and could keep travelers or soldiers fed far from home. Soft cheeses, on the other hand, were best eaten quickly, and sometimes that quickness was a necessity. A fresh, medieval soft cheese might start to ooze or stink in record time. Monasteries became famous for their cheese-making traditions. Partly because monks were forbidden from eating meat on many days of the year, they needed reliable protein alternatives. Cheese filled the gap beautifully. Over centuries, abbeys refined recipes, experimented with herbs, and occasionally created legendary stinkers. The tradition of strong-smelling monks' cheeses can be traced right back to these cloisters. Picture a stone cellar stacked with wheels of ripening cheese. The air would have been damp, tangy, and, to the uninitiated, unpleasant. But to the monks, this was the smell of nourishment, discipline, and maybe a little profit, because monasteries also sold their cheeses to nearby towns, earning steady income. For peasants, cheese was simpler. They often made small, crumbly varieties from goat or sheep's milk. These weren't aged for long. They were eaten quickly, often with coarse bread or pottage. It was cheap, filling, and far more practical than trying to keep milk fresh. The wealthy, however, developed a taste for more elaborate dairy. Records mention cheeses flavored with herbs, wrapped in leaves, or even smoked. Butter was served at noble tables alongside roasted meats, sometimes as a dipping sauce, and, in some cases, nobles imported foreign cheeses, turning them into symbols of refinement. Of course, not everything was appetizing. Aged cheeses could grow rinds so hard they needed to be chiseled open. Others developed such pungent odors that even medieval diners complained about them. And yet they ate them anyway. Because when your food options are otherwise salted meat and boiled grains, even the stinkiest cheese feels like variety. Cheese also slipped into the realm of medicine. Physicians argued endlessly about which cheeses were healthy and which caused ill humors. Fresh cheeses were thought to be cooling, but dangerous if eaten in excess. Aged cheeses were warming, but supposedly difficult to digest. One 13th century writer declared that old cheese was better for the teeth than a file. Which, while memorable, may not be the glowing endorsement the cheesemakers hoped for. So, medieval Europe lived surrounded by dairy, churned in butter tubs, ripening in monastery cellars, or quietly molding in peasant cottages. It smelled strange, it tasted stronger than most of us are used to, and it was absolutely everywhere. In a world without refrigeration, cheese and butter weren't luxuries. They were survival. And sometimes survival came with a very sharp odor. All right, let's slice into another staple of the medieval table. If cheese was the protein, bread was the canvas. It was the foundation of almost every meal, whether you were a peasant breaking your teeth on a dark rye loaf, or a noble gently nibbling a delicate manchet made from refined wheat. The role of bread in medieval diets, from rye loaves to fancy white manchet. Bread, quite simply, was the medieval diet. For peasants, it could make up as much as 70 to 80% of daily calories. And for nobles, though their tables overflowed with meats and sauces, bread was still present at every meal, sometimes as food, sometimes as plate. Let's start with the peasant's loaf. The vast majority of medieval people ate bread made from rye, barley, or oats. These grains were cheaper and easier to grow than wheat, especially in northern Europe. The resulting loaves were dense, heavy, and often slightly sour. Sometimes they were mixed with beans or peas to stretch the flour further, and sometimes, less pleasantly, they were cut with ground-up chaff or even clay if times were bad. This wasn't artisanal sourdough, it was survival food. The texture was coarse, the crusts were hard, and a loaf might stay fresh for weeks, though fresh in this case usually meant not yet moldy. People softened stale bread by dipping it in broth or ale, or by boiling it into pottage. It filled stomachs, even if it didn't exactly delight taste buds. Now compare that to the nobleman's manchet. This was a refined wheat bread, white and soft, almost cake-like by medieval standards. It required sieved flour, careful kneading, and more effort than most peasants could dream of investing. The result was prized for its pale color, which in medieval symbolism meant purity and status. Eating white bread said, "I am wealthy enough to waste grain by refining it." Servants and lower-ranking guests at noble feasts would receive coarser brown loaves. The master of the household got the prized manchet. It was bread, yes, but it was also hierarchy, visible right on the table. Then there was the curious use of bread as a plate or trencher. Thick slices of stale bread were set down as makeshift dishes. Stews, roasted meats, and sauces were piled on top. The bread soaked up the juices, and once the meal was done, it could either be eaten by the diner or given to the poor, or sometimes to the household dogs. In either case, it meant nothing went to waste. Trenchers could last through multiple meals, absorbing grease until they resembled something between bread and sponge. Not exactly fine dining, but practical. Bread also had a religious dimension. It was central to Christian symbolism, the body of Christ in the Eucharist. That meant bakers often enjoyed a certain respect, and bread itself was treated with ritual care. Dropping a loaf on the ground, for instance, might be considered unlucky or even sacrilegious. Some households made the sign of the cross on dough before baking. Others kept small blessed loaves as charms against illness. But bread wasn't always wholesome. Bad harvests could mean bad grain, and bad grain could mean ergot poisoning. Rye infected with the ergot fungus produced a hallucinogenic, toxic loaf. Victims suffered convulsions, burning sensations, and in some cases, madness or death. Whole villages could be struck at once. The phenomenon was called St. Anthony's Fire, and though people didn't know its cause, they knew its misery. So even bread, the staff of life, came with risks. The variety of medieval breads was wider than you might expect. Flatbreads appeared in warmer regions, especially where ovens were scarce. Sweetened breads with honey or dried fruits appeared on feast days. And in monasteries, bread came in carefully measured rations, plain and predictable, but baked with monastic discipline. It's worth noting that the smell of baking bread was just as beloved then as now. Some medieval texts even wax poetic about it, describing warm loaves as comforting, almost divine. In a world where meat was scarce and vegetables were seasonal, bread was the daily constant. It filled you up, carried your stew, and reminded you, at least briefly, that life wasn't entirely unpleasant. So, bread in the Middle Ages wasn't just food. It was economy, religion, medicine, and status. From hard rye crusts in a cottage to golden manchets in a lord's hall, it told you who you were, what you had, and what you lacked. Every bite was both nourishment and a reminder of your place in the great medieval order. Excellent. Let's wash all that bread down, because after trudging through centuries of heavy rye loaves, stale trenchers, and monk's cheese, you're going to need something to drink. And, thankfully, medieval Europe had plenty of options, though not the ones you might expect. Part 13. Ale, Beer, and Wine. How Everyone Stayed Hydrated in the Middle Ages. You've probably heard the claim that medieval people drank ale because the water wasn't safe. It's one of those history tidbits that makes the rounds at dinner parties. And, like most dinner party facts, it's only half true. Water wasn't universally deadly. People did drink it, especially in rural areas, where streams and wells might be relatively clean. But in crowded towns, water sources were often polluted with waste, animal runoff, dye pits, you name it. So water wasn't avoided altogether, but it wasn't trusted either. And that's where ale, beer, and wine stepped in. Let's start with ale. This was the everyday drink of Northern Europe. It was brewed from malted grains, usually barley, and flavored in its earliest forms with herbs or groot, a mixture that could include heather, yarrow, or bog myrtle. Later, hops arrived from the Low Countries and changed the game. Hopped beer lasted longer, traveled better, and slowly overtook the older styles. But the important detail is this. Everyday ale was weak. Very weak. Think closer to 1 or 2% alcohol. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about hydration. The brewing process involved boiling the liquid, which killed off bacteria, and the alcohol gave it a little preservative boost. So, children drank ale. Peasants drank ale. Monks drank ale. Everyone drank ale. Then there was beer. Today, we don't separate ale and beer much, but in the Middle Ages, beer specifically meant hopped varieties. Beer had a sharper taste and a longer shelf life. This made it particularly popular in trade cities like Hamburg or Amsterdam, where brewers exported their barrels far and wide. Beer was a commercial powerhouse. By the late Middle Ages, entire guilds formed around brewing, with strict regulations on quality, price, and even how long the brew could sit in barrels. A bad beer could get a brewer fined, or worse, publicly shamed. And nothing ruined your medieval street cred quite like being known as the person who sold sour beer. In the South, of course, it was all about wine. Vineyards stretched across France, Spain, and Italy, producing endless varieties. Wine was so central to Mediterranean culture that it even seeped into medicine. Physicians recommended it for everything from warming the stomach to curing melancholy. And because grapes didn't grow well in northern climates, importing wine became a mark of wealth. If you were sipping Bordeaux in England, you were showing off. But wine, like ale, came in many strengths. Cheap tavern wine could be thin, sour, and barely drinkable without spices or honey mixed in. High-end wines, aged and carefully crafted, might be reserved for nobility or the church. Monasteries, again, were at the center of production, their vineyards laying the foundations of modern French winemaking. For variety, there were also mead and cider. Mead, made from honey, was older than recorded history and lingered in the medieval North, especially in places like Scandinavia. Cider flourished in apple-rich regions like Normandy and parts of England. These weren't quite as widespread as ale or wine, but they filled the gaps when grain or grapes were scarce. And yes, people did get drunk. Taverns were noisy, sometimes violent places. Alehouses dotted towns and villages, offering cheap drink and company. But the image of medieval people staggering around constantly tipsy isn't accurate. Most daily drink was too weak for that. Getting drunk was a choice and often saved for feast days, festivals, or long nights of storytelling by the fire. It's worth noting that drinks were often flavored or spiced. Mulled wine with cinnamon and cloves, if you could afford the spices, was a winter favorite. Ale might be warmed and sweetened with honey, and the upper classes liked to show off by mixing elaborate concoctions. Part drink, part medicine, part performance art. So, staying hydrated in the Middle Ages wasn't as grim as it sounds. Your cup might not hold sparkling water or orange juice, but it would likely have something safe, if a little sour, to sip. Ale for breakfast, ale for supper, maybe a splash of wine if you had the means. It was practical, it was communal, and it got you through the day. Of course, this dependence on drink had its critics. Some moralists complained that alehouses led to laziness, gossip, and sin. One 14th-century text grumbled that brewers watered down their ale and tavern keepers cheated customers, which just proves that even in the Middle Ages, people loved to complain about overpriced drinks. So, the medieval world flowed with ale, beer, wine, mead, and cider. Not quite a golden age of craft beverages, but more varied and safer than plain water from a suspicious-looking well. In the end, hydration wasn't just survival. It was ritual, trade, and sometimes entertainment. Perfect. We've had our bread, our cheese, and our ale. So let's carve into something that was far rarer and more contested. Meat. Because in the Middle Ages, meat wasn't just food. It was hierarchy, religion, and status served on a platter. Medieval meat and the strange status of who got to eat it. Meat was, by medieval standards, a luxury. Not because animals were scarce. Pigs, sheep, cattle, and poultry wandered through villages and forests, but because who was allowed to eat them, and how often, was carefully controlled. So, let's chew through the layers. For the peasantry, meat was an occasional treat. Most diets centered on grains, legumes, and dairy. But when meat appeared, it was usually pork. Why pork? Because pigs were low maintenance. They could forage in woods, eat scraps, and essentially take care of themselves until it was time for the slaughter. Salted pork, bacon, or lard often became a peasant's main, and sometimes only, connection to the world of meat. Game animals like deer or wild boar were technically everywhere, but they belonged to the Lord. Hunting laws were strict. Taking a rabbit from the wrong patch of forest could land you in serious trouble. So while nobles feasted on venison, Peasants dreamed about it and settled for the occasional stolen hare. Or, more often, they didn't. For the nobility, meat was the center of the table. Venison, pheasant, swan, peacock, boar, the list goes on. Not only were they eating the choicest cuts, but they were also displaying them with flair. Roasts arrived whole, often with feathers or hides reattached to impress diners. A roast peacock might be presented resplendent in its plumes, more centerpiece than sustenance. And yes, it was a show of wealth as much as appetite. A noble's table groaning with meat wasn't about hunger, it was about power. To kill game legally, to raise animals in abundance, to afford the salt and spices to preserve or flavor them, these were all signs of privilege. Religion, naturally, complicated things. Fasting rules restricted meat consumption on Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous other holy days. This meant that for perhaps a third of the year, Christians were technically avoiding meat. In practice, wealthier households substituted fish or elaborate egg and cheese dishes. The poor mostly just ate what they always did: bread, pottage, and the occasional salted herring. There were loopholes, of course. One of the most famous involved beavers. Because their tails were flat and scaly, some churchmen argued they counted as fish. So, yes, medieval diners could tuck into a beaver tail on a fasting day with a clear conscience. Otters and puffins received similar treatment in certain regions. If it lived in water, it might just squeak by as fish. Animals also carried symbolic weight. The boar was ferocious, so roasting one was a show of strength. Venison was noble, so it was associated with refinement and privilege. Chickens and ducks were more everyday, but even they were ranked. Capons, castrated roosters, were considered finer, as their meat was more tender. Preservation shaped a lot of medieval meat culture. Fresh meat was rare unless you lived near the source. Most meat was salted, smoked, or dried to last through the seasons. This gave it a different flavor and texture than we expect today. It was chewier, saltier, and sometimes suspiciously gray. Spices and sauces weren't just for show, they helped mask the less appealing qualities of preserved meat. Even within a household, meat reflected status. The lord might receive the venison haunch or boar's head. Servants might gnaw on offal, tripe, or boiled scraps. Nothing was wasted, but everything was ranked. In many ways, the division of a slaughtered animal mirrored the division of society itself. And then there were the truly bizarre meats. Wealthy banquets sometimes featured dolphins or porpoises, eaten under the "it's technically a fish" loophole. Cranes, herons, even hedgehogs make cameo appearances in surviving cookbooks. One French text calmly provides a recipe for roasted hedgehog, complete with instructions on how to singe off the spines. Because why not? So, medieval meat wasn't simply what you ate, it was who you were. A peasant's salted bacon, a monk's fish dinner, a king's roast swan, each carried meaning. Meat was wealth, faith, legality, and spectacle, all bound together. It was food that spoke, loudly, even before anyone took a bite. All right, let's slip back into the smoky warmth of the hearth, where meat and bread were transformed into meals. Because while medieval food might seem strange to us, the kitchens that produced it were even stranger. Forget stainless steel counters and neatly arranged spice racks. This was a world of open fires, cauldrons, and cooks who doubled as half engineers, half jugglers. Medieval kitchens, from castle hearths to town bakehouses. Let's begin with the castle kitchen. Picture a cavernous hall, stone walls blackened with centuries of soot, and a fire so large it could roast an entire ox, which on feast days it sometimes did. The kitchen was one of the busiest places in a castle. Dozens of servants moved constantly, turning spits, chopping herbs, fetching water, stoking fires. At the center, a master cook orchestrated the chaos. And yes, it was chaos. There were no timers, no thermometers, no written recipes pinned on the wall. Everything depended on experience, instinct, and sometimes sheer luck. Cooking fires were tricky. Unlike a modern stovetop, which politely waits for you to set the temperature, a medieval hearth was unpredictable. Too hot, and your stew boiled over. Too cold, and the roast remained raw. Cooks managed this by shifting pots closer or further from the flame, hanging cauldrons at different heights, or burying embers under layers of ash to keep a gentle heat overnight. It was as much art as science, though with a lot more smoke in your eyes. Roasting was the pinnacle of medieval cookery. It required specialized equipment, great iron spits, sometimes cranked by hand, sometimes by ingenious machines powered by weights, pulleys, or even dogs and treadwheels. Yes, there were dogs whose sole job was to walk endlessly in a wheel, like furry little hamsters, to turn a spit of roasting meat. Imagine explaining that on your resume. Baking was another cornerstone, but ovens were expensive to build and fuel. Not every household had one. Instead, villages often relied on communal bakehouses. Families prepared their dough at home, then carried it to the town oven, where a baker or appointed official managed the fire. This meant your bread was baked alongside everyone else's, in a weekly rhythm that defined community life. For nobles, of course, private ovens were a matter of pride. Some castles had enormous brick ovens capable of producing dozens of loaves at once. Others specialized in pastries or meat pies, luxuries requiring controlled, steady heat. Utensils were fewer than we'd imagine. Cauldrons, skillets, long-handled spoons, knives, ladles, and mortars for grinding spices. No forks yet. That came later. And everything was made of wood, iron, or ceramic. Cooks had to be strong, skilled, and resourceful. One wrong move and you might ruin not just dinner, but an entire lord's feast. Of course, with fires burning constantly, kitchens were dangerous. Accidents were common. A stray spark could set rushes or thatch alight. More than one medieval castle met its end because the kitchen blaze got out of hand. And cooks themselves risked burns, smoke inhalation, or even collapsing under the sheer heat. A medieval kitchen in full swing was more like a furnace with food in it than a tidy workspace. At the humbler end, peasant kitchens were simpler. Most cottages had just a single hearth. Cooking happened in one pot, shared by the whole family. Pottage simmered slowly, with ingredients added whenever available. Bread was baked at the communal oven, and meat, if there was any, was usually boiled to stretch it further. Practical, unglamorous, and efficient. And then there were monastic kitchens. These combined discipline with scale. Monasteries could house dozens or even hundreds of monks, all of whom needed feeding. Kitchens were vast, organized, and surprisingly efficient. Vegetables, fish, dairy, and bread dominated, with meat strictly regulated. Some monasteries became known for their kitchen innovations, brewing, cheesemaking, even early forms of what we'd call institutional catering. Despite the grime and danger, kitchens were places of creativity. Recipes might not look like ours, but cooks experimented constantly, mixing spices, inventing sauces, or devising ingenious ways to disguise leftovers. Banquet cooks, in particular, were part chef, part showman. They could turn a pie into a spectacle by hiding live birds inside, ready to burst out when cut. Or they might gild a roast in gold leaf, because why not? Subtlety was not the medieval kitchen's strong suit, so medieval kitchens were smoky, loud, and slightly hazardous, but they were also the beating heart of daily life. Whether a single pot in a cottage or a roaring hearth in a castle, the kitchen was where survival became sustenance, and sustenance sometimes, if you were lucky, became a feast. All right, let's keep ladling this story out slowly, like a pottage that never quite runs out. Because for all the roasts, pies, and golden displays of meat, medieval people ate something else much more often. Something quieter, humbler, and, frankly, greener. Vegetables and herbs, the overlooked half of the medieval diet. When most people imagine medieval food, they picture mountains of meat. Huge roasted boars dripping with fat, hunters returning with deer, nobles gnawing bones in great halls, and yes, that did happen, sometimes. But in reality, for most of the population, the diet was dominated not by meat, but by plants. Vegetables, legumes, and herbs were the quiet staples that kept people alive. Let's start with the basics: beans and peas. These were the champions of the medieval kitchen garden. They were filling, versatile, and crucial for nutrition. Peas, dried or fresh, made their way into soups and stews. Broad beans, sometimes called fava beans, were boiled, mashed, or fried. They weren't glamorous, but they kept you going. Without them, much of Europe's poor would have simply starved. Then there was the noble cabbage. It's easy to laugh at cabbage. It's not exactly the king of vegetables. But in the Middle Ages, it was dependable. It grew well, lasted long, and filled stomachs. Cookbooks of the time even contain recipes to dress it up, adding herbs, spices, or even a splash of vinegar. The downside. A diet heavy on beans and cabbage had certain, shall we say, digestive consequences. Let's just say medieval cottages may not have smelled entirely of roses. Root vegetables were also essential. Turnips were common, eaten, boiled, roasted, or mashed. Carrots existed, though not always orange. Medieval carrots came in purple, yellow, or white. Parsnips, onions, and leeks were staples too. Garlic was especially beloved, though it was sometimes considered a food of the lower classes, too pungent for refined palates. Still, it flavored countless dishes. In a world without refrigeration, strong seasoning was your friend. And then there were the greens. Spinach had arrived in Europe from the Arab world by the 12th century. Chard, sorrel, lettuce, and various wild herbs often found their way into pots. Some were cultivated in gardens, while others were simply gathered from fields and hedgerows. Dandelions, nettles, and other wild plants could become part of dinner if nothing better was available. In fact, much of medieval cooking was about using what you had. Anything edible was welcome. Of course, vegetables alone can be a bit plain, which is why herbs played such a huge role. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, yes, like the song, were all grown in medieval gardens. Mint, dill, fennel, and lovage added brightness. And then there were medicinal herbs like hyssop or rue, which might double as both seasoning and cure. A monastery garden often had dozens of herbs, carefully cultivated not just for flavor, but for healing. And let's not forget onions and leeks. They deserve their own spotlight, because they show up constantly in medieval records. If you read a 14th century recipe and it doesn't have onions, it probably just forgot to mention them. Leeks were so popular in Wales that they became a national symbol. To this day, Welsh soldiers wear leeks on St. David's Day, which is an oddly vegetable-forward way to celebrate patriotism. What's striking is that medieval diets were far more plant-heavy than most people assume. Nobles indulged in meat when they could, but even their feasts were padded with vegetable dishes, legumes, and breads. And for peasants, vegetables weren't side dishes. They were the main event. Pottage, the universal stew, was essentially a vegetable base that might occasionally, if fortune smiled, receive a bone or a scrap of bacon. There's also the matter of fasting. We've already drifted through how medieval fasting rules shaped diets. And here, vegetables were the saving grace. When meat was forbidden, beans, peas, cabbages, and herbs kept everyone fed. In fact, fasting days meant people leaned even more on plants, with fish or dairy filling in the gaps. This religious framework made vegetables absolutely central. It's easy to overlook them when the chronicles talk of feasts and hunts, but vegetables carried Europe through winters, famines, and lean years. The glitzy feasts of nobles might catch the eye, but the cabbage patch in a peasant's garden was the real, unsung hero of medieval survival. So, next time you picture a medieval banquet, don't just imagine the roasted swan or the spiced venison. Picture the turnips, the onions, the peas, and the humble beans. And they may not look dramatic piled high on a trencher, but they're what truly fed the Middle Ages. Perfect. Let's keep our journey flowing. We've nibbled on cabbage and beans, so now it feels right to step outside the smoky hall and wander through the little plots of earth where those humble foods were born. Because before you can eat, you have to grow. The medieval garden. How people grew their food. If you imagine a medieval village from above, the gardens are the first thing that stand out. Every cottage had one. Sometimes neat, sometimes chaotic, sometimes just a jumble of plants and herbs fighting for space. But they were absolutely essential. Without gardens, most people simply wouldn't eat. The medieval garden wasn't just for vegetables. It was a blend of practicality and necessity. There were beans climbing rough poles, rows of onions and leeks, cabbage sprawling in its leafy bulk, and peas twining along the edges. And tucked between them, herbs: parsley, sage, dill, fennel, thyme, each one prized for flavor, medicine, or both. Monasteries perfected this system. Their cloister gardens were carefully planned. You might find one quadrant filled with culinary herbs, another with medicinal plants, another with vegetables, and another with fruit trees. It wasn't just about beauty, though monks did enjoy symmetry. It was survival disguised as order. Fruit was another treasure of the medieval garden. Apples and pears grew in small orchards. Cherries, plums, and quinces were cultivated where the climate allowed. Strawberries, tiny and wild, not the giant supermarket ones you know, were gathered in summer. Grapes appeared too, though wine production was best in warmer regions. In Northern Europe, grapes often struggled, which is why imported wines were such a luxury. Gardening tools were basic: a spade, a hoe, a simple wooden rake. Seeds were saved from year to year, passed down like heirlooms. And fertilizer, well, you had what you had. Stable manure, human waste, politely called night soil. Ash from the hearth. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Every scrap of organic matter was precious because hungry soil produced hungry people. Gardens also provided a kind of independence. For peasants tied to a lord's land, the strip of earth outside their cottage was theirs to control. It wasn't much, but it was something. Enough to grow onions for stew, beans for protein, herbs to keep meals interesting. And in times of scarcity, that little garden could mean the difference between hardship and true famine. The wealthy, of course, had larger gardens. Manor houses often boasted enclosed spaces, walled to keep out thieves and animals. Inside, you'd find fruit trees carefully pruned, herbs arranged in neat beds, maybe even roses for scent and display. Medieval gardening manuals survive, offering detailed advice on grafting apple trees or planting according to the phases of the moon. Because naturally, even the stars were consulted when deciding where to plant cabbage. It wasn't all food, though. Medicinal plants were vital. A patch of sage for digestion, fennel for colic, mint for stomach pains, chamomile for calming the nerves. Garlic, beloved for flavor, was also used as a remedy against infections, bad air, and even supernatural forces. Whether or not these cures worked, people clung to them. When your local doctor might simply bleed you with a leech, a strong brew of rosemary tea seemed like a safer bet. And then there were flowers. Not the vast ornamental displays of later centuries, but humble blooms. Violets, marigolds, lilies that decorated altars or brightened meals. Yes, flowers in food. Medieval recipes call for violets in salads, rose petals in sauces, and marigold petals in soups. It sounds charmingly poetic until you realize they were mostly there for color and a faint whiff of perfume in an otherwise bland dish. It's worth pausing on just how much labor these gardens required. Weeding, watering, turning the soil, protecting crops from animals. No hoses, no pesticides, no convenient garden centers. Just endless hours of bending, digging, and hoping the weather didn't betray you. A late frost, a summer drought, or a swarm of pests could erase a family's food supply overnight. So, while feasts and roasts dominate the imagination, remember the quiet garden. The beans growing in crooked rows, the onions drying on a cottage wall, the herbs crushed in a mortar to flavor a humble stew. The medieval world was sustained not by banquets, but by these small plots of earth. They weren't glamorous, but they were everything. All right, let's leave the garden behind for a moment. Brush the dirt off your hands, step out of the sun, and follow me back into the smoky hall. Because as much as growing food mattered, so did the act of eating it, together and in a way that everyone agreed was proper. Well, mostly proper. Medieval dining etiquette. What to do and absolutely not do at the table. You might imagine that medieval banquets were all chaos. Meat flying, goblets sloshing, drunken lords gnawing bones, and sometimes, yes, they were. But there was also a surprising amount of etiquette. Not etiquette as we think of it today, with forks and soup spoons, but rules nonetheless, social codes that told you what to do and very firmly what not to do at the table. Let's start with the table itself. If you were lucky enough to dine in a noble hall, you'd sit at long trestled tables, covered with cloths. The lord and his closest company sat at the high table, often raised on a dais. Everyone else found a spot further down, in descending order of importance. Where you sat told the whole room exactly how important or unimportant you were. So yes, dinner was also a seating chart of your social worth. The first rule, wash your hands. Medieval manuals of etiquette repeat this constantly. Bowls of water were passed around before meals, or a servant would pour water over your hands while you held them above a basin. This wasn't just about hygiene. It was about showing respect to your host and to God, since meals were often blessed. So, arriving with muddy hands from the stables, deeply frowned upon. Now, to the business of cutlery, or the lack of it. Forks were rare in most of medieval Europe until the later Middle Ages. Instead, you had your knife, which you brought with you. Every respectable person carried one. It was both your utensil and your weapon, which added a little extra tension to mealtimes. For scooping, you used spoons. For everything else, your hands. The trick was to eat with 3 fingers only, considered more polite than using the whole fist, because nothing says refinement like daintily pinching your meatball between thumb, forefinger, and middle finger. Plates, meanwhile, weren't always plates. In many cases, people used trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that served as edible dishware. You piled food on the bread, it soaked up the juices, and at the end of the meal, you either ate it or gave it to the poor. It sounds sustainable, and it was, though it does mean your plate was sometimes weeks old, dry as wood, until softened with gravy. Another important rule: don't hog the salt. Salt was valuable, and it was placed in little containers called salt cellars along the table. Reaching past your neighbor to dip your meat in salt was considered rude. There were also elaborate rules about not dipping food straight into communal sauces. You should take a bit onto your trencher first, then dip. Direct double dipping, medieval style, was firmly discouraged. Then there were the rules of sharing. Food was often served in large dishes, shared between pairs or small groups, which meant you had to be careful. You shouldn't take the best bit for yourself. You shouldn't stir the dish around with your fingers. And if you tore bread, you should offer the other half to your table mate before eating yours. In short, don't be greedy, at least not in front of witnesses. Some rules, however, sound like they were written for small children. Don't scratch yourself at the table. Don't spit bones onto the floor. Don't wipe your greasy fingers on the tablecloth. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. All of which tells us, of course, that plenty of people were doing exactly that. If you need to write it down as a rule, it means someone was already guilty. There was also the art of drinking politely. Ale, wine, or mead was served in cups, which might also be shared. You were expected to wipe your mouth before drinking, and not to gulp so greedily that liquid ran down your chin. Burping loudly was generally considered bad form, though in some cultures it might pass as a sign of satisfaction. The safest bet: small sips, long pauses, and hoping no one noticed if you dribbled. Conversation had its own rules, too. Speak softly. Don't interrupt. Don't tell long stories while others are trying to eat. And absolutely do not argue at the table. Of course, this being the Middle Ages, people did argue. Dinner could go from polite conversation to thrown goblets in seconds. But in theory, meals were meant to reflect order and harmony. For the nobility, etiquette was even stricter. How you sat, how you chewed, how you gestured with your knife. It was all watched and judged. A clumsy noble risked being seen as uncouth, no matter how much land he owned. And so entire manuals were written to guide young lords and ladies on how not to embarrass themselves. Think of them as medieval self-help books, except instead of how to win friends and influence people, it was how not to drool on your tunic during Lent. And perhaps the oddest rule of all: don't look too hungry. Pouncing on food made you seem greedy. Better to wait, take small portions, and appear above such earthly needs, even if your stomach was growling like a war drum, because nothing says refinement like pretending you don't desperately need the very food placed before you. So yes, medieval dining had plenty of rules, some sensible, some strange, many ignored. But together, they show a world where even eating, one of the most basic acts, was wrapped in ritual, hierarchy, and the constant pressure to behave. ChatGPT said, "All right, let's stay seated at that long trestle table a little longer," because while the lords and ladies were dabbing their lips politely and pretending not to be starving, someone else was making sure all of it actually worked. And no, It wasn't magic, it was servants, a small army of them. The role of servants at a medieval feast, invisible hands behind the banquet. A medieval banquet looked effortless if you were sitting at the high table. Dishes appeared one after another. Ale was poured before your cup was even empty. The room filled with music and warmth. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. Servants scurrying, hauling, pouring, scrubbing. Every bite of meat, every trencher of bread, every jug of wine depended on their labor. Let's start at the bottom. The kitchen boys. They were usually young, poor, and not especially cherished. Their job was to chop, fetch, stir, and, above all, sweat. Imagine the kitchen, full of smoke from open hearths, meat spitting fat into the fire, kettles of pottage bubbling away. Now imagine standing there for 12 hours, turning a roasting spit by hand. Not glamorous, not healthy, and yet, without them, no banquet happened. Next came the servers and carvers. Serving food wasn't just a matter of plopping it down on the table. It was a performance. The server had to bow, present the dish, and place it in front of the right person without spilling. Carving meat was practically an art form, with its own manuals. You didn't just hack a goose in half, you sliced it with elegance, portioned it neatly, and handed it off like a jewel. A clumsy carver could embarrass an entire household. Then there were the cupbearers. Their job sounds simple. Keep the Lord's cup filled, but it carried enormous trust. Why? Because poison was a constant fear. The cupbearer often tasted the drink before handing it over to prove it was safe, which meant loyalty mattered more than skill. Better a faithful but clumsy cousin than a graceful stranger who might slip you arsenic. And, of course, the sewer. Not what you're thinking. In medieval terms, the sewer was the one who arranged the courses, supervised their presentation, and made sure the dishes arrived in the proper order. They were like the maitre d' of the feast. If something went wrong, the wrong sauce with the wrong meat, for example, they got the blame, because nothing ruins a banquet like venison arriving before the pottage. Music, too, required servants, or at least hired entertainers. Minstrels, harpers, and sometimes acrobats performed while guests ate. And guess who set up the instruments, fetched the props, and cleaned up afterward? Servants, again. The nobility clapped politely, then returned to their trencher. The staff kept working. Cleanliness was another hidden burden. Those white tablecloths, someone had to scrub them afterward. The cups and trenchers, someone had to wash or dispose of them. The rushes on the floor, which collected grease and bones and the occasional puddle of ale, they had to be swept out and replaced. The aftermath of a medieval feast wasn't glamorous. It was one giant, sticky mess. And then there was food safety, medieval style. Servants had to guard dishes on their way from the kitchen to the hall, not just from would-be poisoners, but from hungry dogs, opportunistic cats, or even guests who tried to snatch a bite too early. It was a little like carrying trays through a crowded modern buffet, except the consequences of dropping the roast peacock were considerably more severe. For the nobility, the presence of many servants wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. The more people bustling around to serve you, the more important you looked. A lavish feast wasn't just about food. It was about spectacle. Oh, and nothing said wealth and power like being able to command dozens of hands to ensure you never had to pour your own drink. But here's the irony. For the servants themselves, feasts could be both exhausting and tantalizing. They handled trays of roasted venison, gilded pies, and delicate pastries, foods they might never taste themselves. Their meals were usually taken after the guests were finished, often from leftovers. Yes, trenchers soaked in sauce were redistributed to the poor, but they might also end up as the servants' supper. So while the lords dined on swan, the staff got cold cabbage and greasy bread. Yet, despite their invisibility, servants made the entire system function. Without their labor, no noble could maintain the illusion of effortless grandeur. Every graceful dinner, every glittering banquet was really a mountain of sweat, ash, and aching feet. So next time you picture a medieval feast, don't just imagine the lord at the high table or the roasted boar in the center. Imagine the boy turning the spit until his arms gave out, the maid scrubbing grease out of cloth, the cupbearer swallowing nervously before handing over the wine. They were the invisible foundation beneath the spectacle. Perfect. Let us push open the heavy wooden door at the back of the hall and slip into the kitchen. Not the sort of tidy, tiled kitchen, you know, but the smoky, roaring, barely controlled chaos that kept a castle fed. The heat, smoke, and chaos of the medieval kitchen. The medieval kitchen was less of a room and more of an ordeal. Imagine a giant open hearth, flames leaping, sparks flying, iron pots suspended on chains, cauldrons bubbling, meat sizzling on spits that had to be turned by hand, sometimes for hours. The air was thick with smoke, grease, and heat. If the feast hall was glamour, the kitchen was pure endurance. Let's start with the fire. There were no stoves, no neat gas hobs, no low simmer settings. There was wood and sometimes charcoal if you were lucky. The hearth had to be tended constantly, fed logs in just the right way to keep it hot but not out of control. Too little fuel, and the pottage went lukewarm. Too much, and you had charred venison and a ruined day. It was part science, part luck, and mostly frantic guessing. Spits dominated the scene. Large kitchens had several going at once, with boys or low-ranking staff turning them endlessly. Sometimes a special contraption called a turnspit dog was used, a small dog trained to run inside a wheel that rotated the spit. Yes, medieval kitchens were powered partly by actual dog labor. Charming for the guests, less so for the dogs. The smoke was constant. Chimneys existed, but they weren't efficient. The air in a kitchen stung the eyes, choked the lungs, and clung to clothes. Workers coughed, sweated, and kept moving. Imagine trying to carve delicate slices of meat while blinking tears out of your eyes. Not exactly the stuff of glossy cookbooks. Then there was noise. Kitchens were not quiet places. Knives clanged, spits squeaked, kettles boiled over. Orders were shouted. Dogs barked, chickens squawked, cats prowled for scraps. Someone inevitably tripped over something. It was a constant din. The fact that anything emerged edible at the other end feels like a small miracle. Food safety, of course, was an ongoing hazard. Raw meat and fish piled up, flies buzzing. No refrigeration, only salt or smoke to preserve things. Servants moved from slaughter to cooking without washing hands. And yet, somehow, most of the food came out fine. Though an occasional bout of food poisoning probably reminded everyone that not all miracles are equal. One of the most important figures here was the master cook. This wasn't just a sweaty man with a ladle. It was a position of authority. The cook organized supplies, commanded staff, and made sure dishes were ready in the right order. It was half cooking, half logistics. And given that nobles might expect dozens of dishes per course with precise timing, it was like managing a military campaign. Except instead of soldiers, you had cabbage, fish, and a very irritable goose. Storage was part of the chaos, too. Pantries and buttery rooms kept bread, ale, and dried goods. Larders held salted meat or barrels of fish. All of it had to be protected from pests. Rats, mice, insects. Every kitchen had them. Cats helped, but so did traps and constant vigilance. And still, the occasional rat probably found its way into a sack of grain. Then there was cleaning. Imagine scrubbing soot-blackened pots without soap as we know it. Scouring with sand or ash was common. Knives had to be sharpened constantly. And water had to be hauled in by hand, bucket after bucket from the well. It was endless. The kitchen never truly rested, because the next meal was always coming. Despite the conditions, kitchens were also creative places. It's where ordinary ingredients transformed into something surprising. A dull pottage could be livened with herbs. A pie might hide a little sweetness inside. Spices, if the household could afford them, turned ordinary fish into a delicacy. The medieval kitchen was hot, smoky, exhausting, but it was also alive with invention. And while nobles never saw this side of their banquets, the truth is clear. The heat, the sweat, the ash, the chaos, without it, there was no feast. The banquet hall might glitter with candles and gold, but it was the kitchen, choking with smoke, that made it all possible. All right, let S keep the rhythm flowing. Time to wander back out of the smoky kitchens and into the bustling streets, because not everyone dined under chandeliers or with a goose roasted on a spit. Most people in the Middle Ages grabbed what we might call medieval street food. Medieval street food and market snacks. When we think of medieval Europe, the mind goes straight to banquets, long trestle tables, and nobles dripping grease down their sleeves. But in reality, most people were not at those feasts. Most ate quickly, cheaply, and often standing up. And yes, there was a version of takeaway. Markets were the heart of it all. Every town, no matter how small, had market days. Here, food wasn't just traded in bulk, it was sold hot, ready to eat. Hungry workers, travelers, or even monks who had slipped out of the cloister could grab something to sustain them. Think of it as medieval fast food, minus the fries. Bread, of course, ruled. A hunk of bread was the most portable meal imaginable. But bakers didn't just sell loaves, they sold pies. Pies were the ultimate medieval snack. Bread or pastry crusts filled with meat, fish, or vegetables. Hand pies, essentially. You could hold one, walk with it, eat it, and toss the crust if it was too hard. Very practical and very filling. Pottage on the go was also common. That's the thick, stew-like mix of grains, beans, and whatever scraps were handy. Vendors ladled it out into bowls, or even into hollowed bread. Portable, edible bowls, convenient, and just a little soggy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap. And it kept you alive. Then there were fish stalls. Fried or grilled fish was a popular street option. Eels in particular. Yes, medieval people adored eels, which today feel more like something you politely decline. In London, entire markets specialized in eel pies. Imagine the smell of a hot day in summer with baskets of steaming eels and fish frying in open pans. Appetizing in its way, though perhaps best enjoyed at a distance. Sweet options existed too. Honey cakes were sold in markets. So were candied nuts, gingerbread, and even spiced wine ladled out by the cup. No Starbucks, but you could grab a warm drink if you had the coins. Even the poorest might splurge on a small honey cake, just to break the monotony of gruel. Markets also sold roasted meats. Not the great roasts of noble halls, but skewers of meat or chunks of sausage, cooked over open flame. This was food for travelers and laborers, hot, hearty, and usually oversalted to keep it from spoiling. Think of it as the medieval kebab stand. It's easy to forget that hygiene was not a strong point. Street vendors worked in open air, with animals wandering around. Dogs, pigs, and geese shared the space. Spilled beer mingled with mud. A vendor might handle money, meat, and a filthy rag in the same motion. So yes, food poisoning was always on the table. But hunger has a way of lowering standards. And who ate this street food? Not just peasants. Traveling merchants, students, and even minor nobles on the move. It was quick, cheap, and sometimes the only option. Universities in Paris or Oxford were notorious for students eating pies and drinking ale from stalls, living on what the market could provide. Think of it as the medieval student diet. Bread, pie, cheap beer, repeat. Interestingly, some food was considered so ordinary it blurred the line between home and market. Roasted chestnuts, apples, nuts, sold on corners, eaten by everyone. If you'd wandered through a medieval fair, the smell would have been strangely familiar. Not so different from walking past a winter market today. So, while the castles glimmered with peacocks and spiced wine, the streets kept people alive with their humbler fare. Simple pies, fried eels, hot chestnuts, not glamorous, not refined, but practical, portable, and endlessly important. Perfect, let's keep drifting, but this time, step back into the grand halls of nobility. Because while the markets bustled with steaming pies and fried eels, the lords and ladies had a different obsession: showing off. Food wasn't just nourishment for them. It was theater. It was politics. It was a way of saying, "Look how wealthy I am. Now please notice the swan on my table wearing a crown." Part 22. How Nobles Showed Off with Food. Edible Displays of Power. If you ever get the sense that medieval nobles were a little insecure about their status, you're absolutely right. And nowhere was that clearer than at the dinner table. Food wasn't only to be eaten. It was to be displayed, admired, and whispered about for weeks afterward. Let's begin with the subtle art of making food inedible. Because the more money you had, the less you wanted to eat like everyone else. A peasant's stew might be filling, practical, and reasonably tasty. So, naturally, the nobility went out of their way to make things absurd. Brightly dyed jellies in improbable colors, pastries shaped into castles, animals, or saints. Whole animals reassembled after cooking, posed dramatically on the table. If it looked ridiculous, it was perfect. One favorite? The cockentrice. Half a pig, half a capon, sewn together after roasting. Yes, Frankenstein food existed in the 1400s, and it was served with great delight. Guests were expected to marvel at it, not question the poor cook who had to stitch the parts together with kitchen twine. Then there were the subtleties. Despite the name, they were anything but subtle. These were elaborate sugar sculptures, dyed and shaped into whatever the host wanted: castles, saints, or scenes from battles. They were placed between courses like edible dioramas. Of course, they weren't really meant to be eaten. Sugar was far too precious. Guests might nibble, but mostly they admired. It was like installing a chandelier of sugar, then quietly hoping no one touched it. Roasted peacocks were another favorite display, but serving them plain was not enough. The bird would be cooked, then carefully redressed in its own feathers, arranged so it looked alive and magnificent. Sometimes a bit of gold leaf was added to the beak or claws. The result? A glittering, feathered centerpiece that looked fabulous but tasted rather stringy. Again, it wasn't about eating, it was about status. There were also entertainment foods. A pie might be baked with live birds inside to fly out when it was cut open. This was less about feeding guests and more about startling them. Imagine a dinner where you've just gotten comfortable, and suddenly 20 sparrows are flapping around the room. It made for excellent conversation, if not for excellent eating. Nobles also liked to experiment with impossible colors. Dishes dyed with saffron, parsley, sandalwood, or even crushed insects to achieve bright reds and purples. The point was to make food look as far from natural as possible. Green eggs and ham would have been right at home on a medieval noble's table. And it wasn't just about the food itself. The tableware screamed wealth, too. Gold and silver plates, jewel-encrusted goblets, knives with handles carved from ivory. The food might be lukewarm, but it was sitting on a fortune. Even the salt was presented in ornate, towering salt cellars, because salt itself was precious and nobles never missed a chance to remind you of it. Of course, this all came at a cost. Literally. A noble hosting such a feast might bankrupt themselves in the process. But the point wasn't thrift. The point was spectacle. Better to impress your guests with a sugar fortress and go into debt than serve them something simple and risk being thought ordinary. And how did guests react? Well, they were expected to pretend to enjoy it all. Whether the bird tasted like string, the pie crust was too hard, or the sugar sculpture shattered in their lap. Politeness dictated admiration, because that's what these feasts were about. Politics disguised as dinner. You weren't just eating, you were performing loyalty, respect, and a bit of awe. So while peasants dined on onions and barley, nobles staged entire edible dramas. Half pigs stitched to chickens, gilded peacocks, and pies that exploded with live birds. A dinner party wasn't just a meal. It was a declaration. I am rich enough to waste food spectacularly. All right, let's keep drifting forward. We've watched nobles stage their edible circus acts, but naturally, one question lingers in the air. What did all of this actually cost? Because those cockatrices and sugar castles didn't just materialize from thin air, or from the terrified sweat of cooks alone. They came with price tags. And if you thought your grocery bill was high, medieval extravagance would have made even a duke clutch his purse. The price of all this food. What a medieval meal really cost. To begin, it's worth remembering that food was not cheap in the Middle Ages. Most ordinary households spent the majority of their income just feeding themselves. Grain prices swung wildly with harvests, and a bad year could mean famine. So when nobles staged a feast, they weren't just being generous. They were showing off that they could buy more food in a week than a peasant family might see in a year. Let's start with bread. At the bottom end, coarse rye or barley bread was affordable. But fine white wheat bread, called manchet in England, was a luxury. Only the wealthy could afford it regularly. And they ate it proudly, leaving the darker loaves for everyone else. A single large loaf of white bread could cost what a laborer earned in an entire day. Then there was meat. Meat wasn't something peasants ate daily. For nobles, it was expected, and the rarer the meat, the higher the bragging rights. Beef and pork were common enough, but venison? That was the king's game. Literally. Hunting rights were restricted, so venison came at a premium. Serving it announced not just wealth but access to royal privilege. And then we reach the peacock problem. Yes, roasting a peacock was flashy, but acquiring one was far more expensive than simply grabbing a chicken. Peacocks had to be raised as ornamental birds, not practical livestock. So slaughtering one just to gild it and redress it in feathers was basically the equivalent of setting money on fire, for fun. Spices, though, were the true wallet drainers. We talked about how saffron, pepper, and cloves could cost more than gold by weight. For a great feast, nobles might order entire pounds of spice. Imagine inviting your friends to dinner and casually tossing a fortune excess worth of cinnamon into a pie just to make the crust smell nice. That was the level of performative waste we're dealing with. And let's not forget sugar, imported, rare, and incredibly expensive. So those giant sugar sculptures on the table weren't just whimsical. They were financial statements. A noble with a sugar cathedral on display was quietly saying, "I have so much money, I can literally build architecture out of candy." Now, what did it all add up to? Records from great households give us a clue. A single medieval banquet might consume hundreds of animals, barrels of wine, and mountains of bread. The cost of one evening's feast could rival the annual income of a prosperous merchant. Nobles sometimes bankrupted themselves just keeping up with each other. Hosting the king could destroy a family's finances for years, but refusing would destroy their reputation even faster. It's worth noting that servants and staff were also part of the bill. You didn't just pay for food, you paid for the army of cooks, spit-turners, brewers, bakers, and servers who made it happen. Feasts required weeks of preparation and hundreds of hands. In some great households, the kitchen staff alone could number over 100. Feeding your guests meant feeding all of them, too. For ordinary people looking on, the spectacle must have been staggering. A noble's feast wasn't simply about stuffing bellies, it was about displaying power through abundance. The sheer cost was the message. If you could waste saffron on dyeing a sauce bright yellow, you clearly had more wealth than sense, and that was precisely the point. So the price of a medieval meal was never just measured in coins. It was measured in reputation, in debts owed, in bankruptcies quietly looming. The table groaned under its weight, not just of food, but of economics and politics. One sugar swan could cost more than a peasant's house. One banquet could cost more than a year's wages. And yet nobles smiled, waved their jeweled goblets, and ordered another pie stuffed with live birds. All right, let's refill the goblet and let it slosh gently because food might have been expensive and theatrical. But drink was everywhere. From the peasant's smoky tavern to the king's jeweled banquet hall, alcohol wasn't just a pleasure. It was survival. And occasionally it was also poison. Drinking, like a medieval noble, wine, ale, and the occasional poison. First, let's establish a simple truth. Medieval people drank constantly. And no, it wasn't because they were reckless party animals. It was because water was deeply untrustworthy. Streams doubled as latrines. Wells were often contaminated. Cisterns grew algae. So, unless you lived in a remote mountain village with fresh spring water, you drank ale, or wine, or cider, or mead, all day, every day. For the ordinary folk, ale was the staple. Not strong ale, but small ale, barely alcoholic, closer to a mild beer or fermented barley water. It provided calories, quenched thirst, and, most importantly, didn't make you ill. Children drank it, laborers drank it, and so did grandmothers. It was less a luxury, more a necessity. But the nobility, naturally, had to go one better. Wine was the noble drink par excellence. Not because it was better for hydration, it wasn't, but because it was expensive, imported, and refined. French wine poured into English goblets, Italian vintages carried across the Alps, Spanish sherries arriving by ship. To drink wine every day was to advertise wealth and connections. Of course, nobles didn't always appreciate wine in the way we might. There was no ritual of swirling, sniffing, and noting hints of oak and berry. Instead, medieval diners sometimes preferred their wine spiced, sweetened, or diluted with water. Mulled wine, hippocras, and claret, all heavily altered to mask the taste of what might have been a rather dubious vintage. Think less vineyard connoisseurship, more how much cinnamon can we dump in this before it becomes drinkable. And then there was mead, the honey-based drink of older tradition, still popular though often viewed as a bit rustic by later nobles. It carried the flavor of myth and poetry, but in practical terms it was expensive. Honey wasn't cheap, so mead became another luxury, savored at banquets or gifted between elites, but rarely the everyday drink of peasants. Now, about poison, because if you think serving food was fraught, serving drink could be deadly. Poison was the great paranoia of the medieval court. It was so feared that nobles developed elaborate rituals around their goblets. The use of tasters, servants forced to sip the wine first, was common. Not a glamorous job, but one way to ensure your lord lived a little longer. Special goblets were also devised. Some were made of horn, believed to sweat, or change color if poison touched them. Others were fashioned from unicorn horns, or rather narwhal tusks, because people believed they had anti-poison properties. It didn't work, of course, but it was the thought that counted. Despite the paranoia, poisoning at the table was not nearly as common as nobles feared. Illness, poor preservation, and just bad luck with spoiled wine were far more likely culprits. But still, the image of a glittering goblet filled with danger loomed large in noble imagination. So every sip came with ceremony. Wine wasn't just drink. It was trust, or betrayal. And speaking of ceremony, noble feasts had their own drinking etiquette. The lord drank first, then passed the goblet. Guests toasted one another in long rituals of politeness, often involving elaborate bows and gestures. Drinking was never casual. It was woven into the dance of hierarchy and honor. Meanwhile, back in the tavern, things were simpler. Ale by the mug, wine if you could afford it, cider in apple country. No unicorn horn goblets, no terrified tasters, just a lot of loud conversation, dice games, and the occasional brawl. Taverns were where gossip thrived, where deals were struck, and where peasants forgot their aching backs for an hour. So, while the nobles sipped nervously from gilded goblets, peasants drained mugs of ale with cheerful disregard. The effect, in the end, was the same. A world slightly hazier, a belly slightly warmer, and a life that felt just a little more bearable. All right, let's leave the jeweled goblets of nobles for a while and step into the smoky, noisy, and frankly much more human world of the tavern. Because if there was one place in the Middle Ages where people from nearly every walk of life could end up shoulder to shoulder, it was here, the humble alehouse. Medieval taverns and alehouses, the social life of drinking. Picture it. A low wooden building, beams blackened by years of smoke, a floor of packed dirt strewn with rushes, and the constant haze of fire, tobacco substitutes, and human breath. The smell is somewhere between sour beer, sweat, and roast meat. Not unpleasant, but very earthy. The alehouse was the peasant's living room. Homes were small, cold, and smoky with little space for company, so social life spilled into taverns. Here, neighbors met after long days in the fields, exchanging gossip and complaints. Farmers might discuss harvests, or, more likely, grumble about taxes. It was the medieval equivalent of meeting at the pub after work. What did they drink? Mostly ale. Not the strong kind, small ale, brewed weaker, often cloudy and warm. It wasn't about getting drunk, though of course that happened. It was about hydration and community. In cider-producing regions, apples added some variety, and in wealthier towns, wine might be sold, though usually the cheaper imported kind. Harsh stuff, cut with water and spices. Food was often available too. Simple stews, hunks of bread, perhaps some cheese. If you were lucky, a bit of roast meat. But taverns weren't known for their cuisine. They were known for being places where you could eat without cooking and drink without hauling water. Games were everywhere. Dice games, card-like games with wooden pieces, and betting on anything possible. How long would the candle burn? Who could down a mug the fastest? Which dog would win a scrap in the yard? Gambling was technically frowned upon but rarely stopped. Taverns thrived on it. And with gambling came fights. So much so that taverns had reputations as dangerous places after dark. Still, they weren't only for peasants. Travelers lodged there, merchants struck deals over mugs of ale, and wandering students practically lived in them. Universities in Paris and Oxford were infamous for their students filling taverns, drinking on credit, and occasionally rioting when they didn't like the bill. It gave student nightlife a rather medieval twist. Women also played their part. Some ran taverns as alewives, brewing and selling their own ale. This was respectable work, at least when it was done well. But, of course, alehouses could also double as brothels. The line between tavern and bawdy house was often thin, especially in larger towns. And let's not forget the church's opinion. Clergy railed constantly against taverns as dens of sin, drunkenness, gambling, lust, blasphemy. These were thought to brew in alehouses like yeast in a barrel. But for all their scolding, taverns never went away. People needed them too much. And, truth be told, plenty of priests and monks were known to drop by themselves. By the late Middle Ages, alehouses became so central to daily life that governments tried to regulate them. Licenses, taxes, and even curfews appeared. But taverns carried on, resilient as ever. They were places of laughter, argument, friendship, and escape. Sometimes rowdy, sometimes cozy, but always indispensable. So, while nobles fretted over poisoned goblets in their gilded halls, the common folk relaxed with mugs of ale, dice clattering on wooden tables, and gossip buzzing like flies in the firelight. Less glamorous, perhaps, but far more alive. Excellent. Let's keep the ale flowing, but this time, step behind the barrel instead of sitting at the bench. Because before taverns could slosh mugs across their sticky tables, someone had to actually make the stuff. And brewing in the Middle Ages was less of a science, more of a sticky, smoky art form. Brewing and winemaking, how medieval people actually made their drinks. Let's begin with ale. For most medieval people, ale was as essential as bread. So it wasn't just brewed in taverns, it was brewed in homes, monasteries, and even by wandering vendors with a cauldron and a little luck. The recipe sounds simple. Water, grain, yeast. But yeast wasn't understood as such. Brewers simply relied on wild fermentation, the invisible little helpers in the air. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes it worked disastrously. If you've ever left bread dough out too long and wondered why it smells like socks, medieval brewers knew that experience very well. Hops, the plant we now associate with beer, came later. Early medieval ale was usually unhopped. Instead, brewers used something called gruit, a mixture of herbs like yarrow, rosemary, bog myrtle, and even juniper. The result? A drink that was less bitter, more herbal, and occasionally hallucinogenic, depending on what went into the mix. So yes, medieval ale could make you tipsy in more ways than one. Women dominated brewing at first. The alewives sold their batches directly from their houses. They advertised with ale stakes, a pole with greenery hanging outside the door. Step inside, drop a coin, and walk away with a mug or jug. This gave women a rare foothold in the economy, though predictably, by the late Middle Ages, men began edging them out, especially once brewing became big business. Monasteries, meanwhile, refined brewing into an art. Monks had time, resources, and a steady demand. Their ales became famous for consistency and strength. If you've ever sipped a Trappist beer today, you're tasting the distant descendant of that monastic tradition, though with fewer penitential prayers in the background. Wine, on the other hand, was the noble drink. But even wine wasn't straightforward. Grapes grew best in southern Europe. So in England or northern Germany, wine was imported, often cheap, rough vintages shipped in barrels. Good wine spoiled quickly, and so medieval people constantly doctored it. Spices, sugar, honey, herbs, anything to make it more palatable. A medieval wine tasting would have felt more like a spice market. And then there was mead, made from honey, water, and fermentation. It lingered as the poetic drink of old, favored in sagas and songs. But by the later Middle Ages, mead was expensive, because honey was expensive. So while it had a golden glow in memory, most people rarely tasted it. Fermentation was unpredictable. Brewers and vintners had only trial, error, and tradition to rely on. Too much heat, too little yeast, a poorly cleaned barrel, and your ale could sour overnight. People drank it anyway, of course. The alternative was plain water, which was far worse. Storage was another problem. Glass bottles didn't really exist for common use, so drinks were stored in wooden casks or ceramic jugs. Ale went flat quickly. Wine turned to vinegar unless consumed fast. This is why medieval people brewed and drank constantly. Fresh was always better, and freshness only lasted a few days. So, next time you sip a pint of crisp lager or a clean glass of Cabernet, think of the medieval drinker. Their ale was murky, their wine was spiced, their mead was rare, but it all kept life running. And for them, that was enough. Perfect. Let's step back from the tavern bench and drift into the bakery, where the heartbeat of medieval diet was baked fresh, smoky, and usually a bit gritty. Baking bread, the true staple of medieval life. If there was one food that united peasants and kings alike, it was bread. Though naturally the bread on a royal table looked and tasted very different from the bread baked in a peasant-ass clay oven. For most medieval people, bread was life. Grain was the foundation of the diet, whether wheat, rye, barley, or oats. A bad harvest meant hunger. A failed harvest meant famine. So when people spoke of earning their daily bread, it wasn't metaphorical. It was survival. But bread was not a single, uniform thing. Its texture, flavor, and even color depended entirely on where you stood in the social hierarchy. The poor ate dark, coarse bread, made from rye or barley, sometimes bulked out with peas, beans, or even acorns in desperate times. It was filling, but heavy, and because it was ground on stone querns, the flour often contained tiny fragments of grit. Over a lifetime, that grit wore teeth down to stubs. Dental misery, courtesy of your daily loaf. The wealthy, meanwhile, demanded fine white bread. This was called manchet in England or pain blanc in France. It was made with carefully sifted wheat flour, expensive, labor-intensive, and entirely impractical for the majority. White bread was a status symbol. It said, "I can afford to have my flour sieved by someone else, thank you very much." In between was maslin bread, a mixture of rye and wheat. This was the middle ground, eaten by artisans, merchants, and moderately comfortable households. Not as heavy as rye, not as dainty as manchet. The medieval equivalent of buying mid-range groceries. Baking methods were just as varied. Some households had their own clay or brick ovens, but ovens were expensive to build and maintain. So, in many villages, the lord of the manor or the town authorities controlled a communal oven. Families would mix and knead their dough at home, then carry it to the oven to be baked. Naturally, there were fees involved. Nothing in the Middle Ages came without a tax. Monasteries, again, became centers of bread production. Their ovens could bake enormous batches, feeding monks, servants, and poor folk alike. It's no coincidence that religious houses gave alms in bread. It was the most practical way to feed crowds of hungry people. And bread wasn't just for eating. It doubled as a plate. We've mentioned trenchers already, thick slabs of bread that served as edible dishware. After soaking up gravy and sauces, they could be eaten or tossed to the dogs or given to the poor. No need for fancy ceramic plates when your plate itself could be food. Bread also became part of ritual. The church used it for communion, of course, but households, too, often blessed bread before meals. The loaf was central to both sacred and secular life. It wasn't just food, it was cultural glue. Of course, there were problems. Flour could be adulterated. Bakers might add chalk, sand, or ground beans to stretch their product. Authorities tried to regulate this with something called the Assize of Bread in England, laws that fixed the price and weight of loaves according to grain costs. If a baker cheated, punishments could be severe, from fines to the dreaded pillory. Imagine being locked up in the town square because your bread was a bit too light. Public shaming, fresh from the oven. Despite all this, bread endured. From royal banquets to peasant hovels, it was there, morning to night. Thick and rough or soft and white, it shaped medieval diets more than anything else. So, as you nod off tonight, imagine the smell of wood smoke, warm flour, and a loaf crackling as it cools. A simple sound, a simple comfort, the daily bread of centuries. So, after bread had filled stomachs and dulled the hunger pains, it was porridge and pottage that kept people moving through the long, medieval day. Thick, steaming, endlessly variable. Sometimes humble and gray, sometimes spiced and dotted with scraps of meat, sometimes nothing more than barley boiled into a paste. It was the food of endurance. The meal you could eat every day and still survive, though perhaps without much joy. Porridge and pottage were flexible, forgiving, and infinitely adaptable. They absorbed whatever the season provided. A handful of beans in spring, a little cabbage in winter. Maybe, just maybe, a sliver of bacon if you were lucky. And if you weren't, then a drizzle of ale on top. For peasants, it was survival. For monasteries, it was discipline. And for nobles, oddly enough, it was still a favorite comfort dish, though theirs came with saffron, cinnamon, and sugar sprinkled generously, as though oats could be improved by pretending to be pudding. It was not glamorous. It did not earn poems, or inspire ballads, or grace banquet halls with golden platters. But porridge and pottage sustained the medieval body in a way few other foods could. Simple, repetitive, unavoidable. The culinary equivalent of the background hum of daily life. So let's let that pot simmer quietly on the hearth. Steam rising, wooden spoons resting against the rim, and the quiet bubbling that would have been as familiar in the 13th century as it is today. A bowl of warmth, a comfort, humble but lasting, and perhaps, as you drift into sleep, the perfect reminder that sometimes the simplest things are the ones that carry us through. And so, after drifting through loaves of bread, bubbling pots of pottage, smoky kitchens, and banquets groaning under gilded dishes, we come to the end of our medieval menu. We've seen how food in the Middle Ages was never just food. It was survival for the poor, a performance for the rich, a ritual for the church, and always a reminder of just how much of daily life hinged on whether or not the harvest came in. Bread, porridge, meat, spices, wine, ale, cheese, butter, fish, each one carried its own rules, its own symbolism, its own way of drawing lines between classes. Food could divide, but it also united. Everyone, no matter their station, needed to eat. Everyone tasted the same hunger. Everyone knew the smell of smoke, the sound of a pot simmering, the comfort of a full stomach. Of course, we've laughed a little at the strangeness, too. The roasted peacocks dressed back up in their feathers. The fasting rules that made loopholes bigger than the rules themselves. The etiquette guides that reminded you not to wipe your nose on the tablecloth because apparently that needed to be said. Medieval dining could be extravagant, absurd, and sometimes downright unappetizing. But it was also deeply human, an endless search for warmth, for nourishment, for something that felt like home. So, as we set aside the trenchers and snuff out the torches in the kitchen, let's leave the Middle Ages to their supper. The bread is cooling, the stew is thickening, the feast is ending. And for us, the story is too. Thank you for wandering through these kitchens and banquet halls with me. I hope the steady rhythm of medieval meals has given your mind a place to rest, and your thoughts a chance to quiet down. Because, much like a pot left to simmer overnight, history always waits. We can pick it up again another evening. For now, though, close your eyes. Let the last traces of wood smoke and spice fade into dreams. And rest well. Good night.